Welcome to Small Business by the Numbers. I'm Holly Wade, the Executive Director of the NFIB Research Center, and joined by my coworker, Peter Hansen, who's the Director of Research and Policy Analysis. Hi, Peter.
Hey, Holly.
So we have the June numbers of our monthly survey of small business owners, and there's a lot to talk about. So I'll start off just giving the headline measure. Our Small Business Optimism Index clocked in at 97.4, and that's up 2.1 points from May. And we're inching closer to the 52-year average of the index. It's the headline measure of how we see or evaluate the small business economy out there. And just to give a bit of flavor to what that looks like as far as the components, there's 10 components within the index. And the three biggest movers, sales expectations improved 8 points, capital expenditure plans increased 4 points, and the big one, better business conditions. So how they are seeing conditions in the next 6 months improved 10 points. So a lot of moving parts in there. And one of the bigger ones, obviously, is that better business conditions. And I think that has probably to do a lot with inflation. So if you want to talk a bit about that, I think that's the big story this time around.
Absolutely. Let's set the scene a little bit on inflation specifically. High levels in consumer price index, that was 4.2% in May. The PCE, personal consumption expenditures, the Fed's preferred index, also at quite a high level, 4.1% in May. Those levels are more than double the Fed's targets. They are significantly up since the start of the year. They are heading in the wrong direction as of that May data. So it's a pressured context. And the reason why, when we were talking last month on this podcast, we were talking about potential cracks, strain, and you covered the headlines that's starting to transform. So get into that SBET data here. What are small businesses telling us on inflation? How is that transitioning right now in this latest June data?
So, as you mentioned, the CPI above the Fed's target of 2%, and it's flowing through. We're seeing it in our data. And small business owners are really feeling the pressure of those higher input costs in operating their business. So right now for the June data, those raising prices, that was up 2 points from May, up 14 points from February. So right now we're at a net 28% of small business owners saying that they increased prices over the last quarter. And those planning to increase prices, that was down 2 points from May, but up 8 points from February. And right now we're sitting at a net 38% of small business owners say that they're planning to increase prices in the next quarter. So those higher input costs with the CPI report, 40% increase over the last 12 months of gas prices. And that's the big headline price commodity that we know small business owners use a lot of gas, whether it's for deliveries, things like that. And those are real issues that they've had to deal with.
Good news is gas prices have tilted back downwards a lot in the last month. So we're seeing gas prices come about 50% of the way back down. They're around $3 in February, up to about $4.50 at peak, maybe around $3.75 current data. So it's about halfway in between. Oil prices, actually like the raw input, looking a bit better. Those are actually nearly back to where they were in February. But it is also like gasoline's kind of a midpoint. Oil's maybe a little bit more optimistic. Traffic through the strait is a little bit more pessimistic, showing that, okay, things aren't fully resolved. There's still that pressure. And I think one thing on costs in the data that you didn't mention just yet, Holly, is the single most important problem data.
That's
where
right.
Inflation ticked up again 3 points in May. It's fourth consecutive month of sliding upwards. It's now the top issue. It's at the highest level since October. It's up 9 points since January. Okay, it's reasonably negative.
1 in 5 small business owners saying that that's their biggest problem in operating their business. And we made such progress before, closing out 2025, but now it's really a big pressure point for small businesses.
And the one positive point, because we've hammered some like inflation's up, PCE, CPI, the actual prices, the single most important problem. But I want to emphasize there is a note of positivity in here. You mentioned plans to raise prices. Those are down. And we see that related to gas prices coming down, oil prices coming down. Hopefully we've turned the corner. We're still kind of catching up to and seeing the price pressure pass through this month of June. But I think we're at a point where optimism for the future is growing. And in a way that kind of circles back to some of the index that you started us out with, where the index is up, and it was really up a lot based on that better business conditions, expect the economy to improve. The vibes are a little better. The vibes are saying, hey, we're turning the corner here. So there is optimism, even if inflation has become a problem in a way that it hasn't been for not a super long time, but since a recent and significant era for inflation.
And looking at sales expectations, as I mentioned, that improved 8 points from May. And that's likely due to small business owners noting that oil prices are falling and consumers have more money in their pocket. And so they're not as stressed about whether they're going to be able to continue or that their customers are still going to spend money, that they're not scaling back in any meaningful way as they can see now. But with that 2-point decline in price plans, it'll be interesting to see next month to see if actual prices start slowing down too, that a lot of that higher gas prices have flowed through. They've accommodated for that, and they're basically set as far as having to recoup those increased costs. Why don't we turn over to the next favorite topic of discussion that is on everybody's mind? And as we're recording this, the BLS came out with their data on the June numbers. But if you want to start us off with the employment landscape for small business.
Yeah, well, let's go straight to our employment index, that single number, best metric for the small business sector, flat, essentially, from May to June. Now, technically, it ticked down 1/10 of a point, and because it ticked down, that's now the 4th consecutive month of decline. So we're at a level right now that is almost exactly the long-term average. Long-term average is 100.0. We're at 100.2. So things are kind of, by that metric, okay. Not great, not as good as they were last year, not as good as they were at the start of the year, but not too bad. And for the components underlying that, we saw a bit of easing in the compensation type component, so a little bit less pressure on raises for businesses, but less pressure on that counterbalanced by a little bit more movement on the hiring front. So net pretty much neutral. I would say those two underlying components are kind of moving in a favorable direction in the sense of like if you're worried about inflation, good to not have too much compensation pressure. And then I think it's always positive when we see small businesses hiring. Everybody wants that. So great news there. So net is on that index alone, okay. Relatively flat, not at a good level in the index, but at an okay level in that we're pretty much aligned with that historical average, which is fine. Now, there's a bit of a story beyond just that index. So the index covers these kind of core central components, but there's a few ways we measure employment, the small business labor market that aren't in that index. And there's a bit of a story there. Why don't you tell us about that, Holly?
There is. And we saw in May, there was this bit of an anomaly with the data that came in. We saw some of the labor metrics or the labor questions decline quite a bit. And I don't know that we were expecting that significant a movement. Two of the areas that we saw in May, labor quality declined a number of points and labor costs increased as a single most important problem that is of concern to small business owners. It recalibrated, let's say, and went back to the trends prior to May. So, for instance, labor quality and availability of labor, that's one of the categories for single most important problem. That was up 6 points from May. We're back to 19% of them saying that that's their biggest challenge in operating their business. And labor costs, we saw that dramatic increase in May. That came back down 6 points to 8% of small business. And that's more uniform to what we've seen previously to that May data set that was a bit of an anomaly, it seems now. And then job openings. We saw job openings increase 3 points. Hiring plans increased 2 points. Those were good signs that the labor market still seems to be relatively strong. And again, that's in context of where we thought it might be going in May, when we saw a lot of movement on the downside with the labor situation, and whether we were thinking, well, is this going to be the beginning of some more significant deterioration in the labor market? But it doesn't appear so. Small business owners are still looking to hire, especially in those industries where they've just had such a hard time: construction, manufacturing, some services. And for those business owners, they are looking to increase staff or at least fill those open positions of turnover in their labor force. And so we saw a bit of a rebound in that space, which was interesting. On the BLS side, which we just had the June numbers come out on the BLS, in May, we saw this huge increase in the number of jobs in leisure and hospitality. Everybody was kind of talking about how that was World Cup, and we saw a complete reverse of that in June with a loss of 61,000. I mean, I thought that was just quite the swing, and who knows what this looks like for the following month, but it seems that that was also a bit of recalibration.
Yeah, crosstabs are hard.
They are. They certainly are. In May, we saw 129,000 national increase in jobs from the BLS. In June, 57,000. So again, recalibration. It's been a little choppy over the last number of months. So it's hard to determine whether we see any sort of trend in these numbers, whether it's ours or the national numbers. But interesting to look at, especially when there's a lot of moving parts in the economy these days.
Yeah, I'm a touch concerned. Let's say, we'll take the under on the May number going forward on the BLS side, in that I think our data trends to lead the BLS data. I mean, some of that is literally structural. Like, we're getting small businesses telling us their plans, and then the BLS is getting what actually then happens. The small business is like, I'm going to hire. And then it takes a while and they hire, and then it shows up in the BLS data. So there's a structural reason why our data, in theory, and I think in practice, often leads the BLS just a little bit. And I think we saw that last year, where BLS is trending down, ours is trending down, and then ours started to tick back up late last year and into the start of this year. And then BLS kind of followed. I think the numbers so far this year, in terms of job counts by month, have been more positive than a lot of folks are expecting, more positive than a lot of second half of late last year. But our numbers then kind of ticked down in the last 3 months. And so it makes me wonder and worry what we're going to see in BLS, let's say, the next 3 months. I'm not hyper concerned, because, as we're talking about, Optimism index somewhat turning the corner. Even the employment index, it's down, but it's still at/slightly above the long-term average. So there's not some big flashing red sign here. But it does make me that little bit concerned of, can we keep up with the reasonably strong job numbers that we've seen for a lot of this year in BLS? I think our data suggests that those numbers might be hard to sustain, that maybe that June, still okay, but lower number is the more realistic level for the next few months.
Probably.
Soft take there. That's just sort of, as we're talking about BLS, as we're comparing it to ours, and that's my point of concern.
Yeah, and I will also say that for BLS, looking at all the revisions over the last 3 months, they were all down.
Yeah.
All the revisions were down.
Yeah.
And by some significant numbers. And so that was a bit of a surprise for me anyway, looking at the numbers. I mean, I think that for May, the revision was around 30,000 down from the original estimates. I mean, I know that for the BLS, for every data collection agency, it's just more difficult for responses, things like that. So it often takes longer. And the revisions seem to be a bit more exaggerated than they have been in the past. But seeing the revisions all negative certainly was something notable in looking at these, as you said, fairly healthy numbers, but were downgraded just a bit from the initial estimates for this. Looking at the rest of our survey, What other areas did you see that stood out to you?
Well, I think you have to talk uncertainty.
Absolutely.
It dovetails with what you're talking about, like BLS data. How well do we really know what's going on? It's no surprise that small business owners who are pulled in 1,000 different directions, working on 1,000,000 different problems, are also having a little bit of trouble knowing exactly which way to go. Uncertainty remains very high. There's a little bit of good news there. Tick down 2 points. I think that's a little bit of that positive corner turning with the index ticking up 2.1 points.
Yeah, feeling a little bit more confident that oil prices won't escalate further, that they're coming back down to earth a bit.
Exactly. Sliding out of I don't know in the positive direction, because there's two sides to I don't know. There's down and there's up, and we've moved a little bit towards up.
Is.
But it's not a lot of movement. We're still way above the historical average, so it remains a real problem for small businesses. What about you, Holly? Any last thoughts, a key takeaway from this report?
One of the key takeaways, and I know we've talked about this in previous episodes, but the current health of the small business. So we asked this question, what's the current health, or how do you evaluate your assessment of your business right now? And we did see a bit of an erosion from excellent to good, but still on the positive side of answer selections for that question. But that's remained fairly stable. So while they're getting hit by all sides of shifts in economic conditions and the challenges that they face, it does appear that their business, as far as customers coming in the door and purchasing their good or service, is remaining pretty stable, and that's a good sign. So we saw, again, a bit of erosion from the top, from excellent to good, but otherwise we haven't seen much noise in the responses on that question over the last 12 months. And so that was one of my big key takeaways, or final takeaways, on a positive side, which is nice to have the positive angle when there's a lot of disruptions going on. How about you?
I think my key takeaway relates to the transition at the Federal Reserve Board. We have a new chair,
We do.
Kevin Warsh. Obviously, we have the May CPI, PCE I mentioned. But looking at this more recent data from our own survey here, okay, there's a little positivity in price plans relative to last month, but that's still high relative to February. Actual prices are still quite high relative to February. Single most important problem, highest in quite a while. There's a lot of pressure there in that data, in that very recent data.
With their dual mandate of inflation and full employment,
Right.
Employment doesn't seem to be deteriorating.
Employment
and inflation seems to be the outlying problem here.
Right. Employment looks okay. Inflation is clearly high in the numbers. So that's a pretty clear signal to the Federal Reserve Board. But, who knows what direction we'll see out of there. Let's start to look forward, to talk about the direction we're going. What are you watching for in the next month before we get the next data?
Sure. So interestingly, I was just reading some articles related to trade and the USMCA, that trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico that's been in place for 16 years. In the last iteration of it, well, it expired, actually, on July 1st. And so the renegotiations of that will start in earnest soon. I mean, obviously, they've all been talking over the last number of months, if not years, about what this new configuration of a trade agreement looks like. I think there's a lot of uncertainty related to that. It doesn't directly impact a lot of small business owners, but indirectly a whole bunch of them. So what this ends up looking like will be very meaningful for many small business owners in varying degrees of impact. Where these conversations go, whether it ends up being a trilateral agreement, whether it becomes more bilateral agreement, what the goals are for the U.S. in resolution in these negotiations, will be interesting to see where we assess the impact might be for small business owners. So that's one of the areas that I think will be something to watch out for. Well, that is a wrap for June's data. There's a lot going on in there, but we covered a lot of territory with inflation and employment. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Small Business by the Numbers, and look forward to another conversation next month. Thank you.